Elizabeth Short was born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1924 to her parents Cleo Alvin Short Jr. and Phoebe May Sawyer. In the lead-up to her death, she had been working as a waitress and lived on Hollywood Boulevard. The day before her body was found, she was seen with a man called Robert Manley who drove Elizabeth to Los Angeles, where she checked into the Baltimore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. Robert Manley left soon after, and Elizabeth was then seen going to the Crown Grill bar, the place where she was last seen alive. The next day, on the 15th of January 1947, someone was out on their morning walk when they came across a woman's body that had been cut in half. Investigators determined her being cut in half was done with surgical precision, as it had left no trauma to her internal organs and no trauma to her bones. She had also been cut from her mouth to her ears, making a smile. Due to blood not being present at the scene, investigators concluded that she had been killed at another location. 9 days after the discovery of Elizabeth's body, the Examiner newspaper received a letter written with cut-out letters. The letter read, "Los Angeles Examiner and other Los Angeles papers, here is Dahlia's belongings, letter to follow." And inside the envelope was Elizabeth Short's Social Security card, birth certificate, pictures, and an address book. Gasoline had been rubbed on all of the items so no fingerprints could be found. Another letter was also sent and later saying, "Turning in Wednesday, January 29, 10 a.m. Had my fun with police, Black Dahlia Avenger." Detectives soon had a suspect named George Hodel, but the case against George Hodel was hidden away until decades later when his son, Steve Hodel, began looking into his dad as a suspect. Steve Hodel, the son, had been 5 at the time of the murder and had grown up to be a police investigator for 17 years before he retired. After looking into his dad as a suspect, he noted how his dad's Los Angeles home had a secret room that he never allowed his children to go in. Other things made Steve believe his dad was responsible for the Black Dahlia murder, such as him having studied surgery at medical school, and George also ran Los Angeles Disease Clinic, so he had the capabilities of mutilating someone. He found pictures of a woman in George's photo albums that looked like Elizabeth Short. In 2014, facial recognition technology was used by an expert which showed a 90 to 95% match of the photo being of Elizabeth Short, but the test was still ultimately inconclusive. Around the time of the murder, police had hidden bugs in George Hodel's home, and he was heard saying, "Suppose I did kill the Black Dahlia, they couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore, because she's dead."
And you allege that it's your father who did this. How did you go about investigating your own father on this case?
Well, actually it was, my father died in 1999, and certain effects came into my possession. And then he was a remarkable man, and of course the first third of my first book goes into the heavy biographics. You kind of have to understand the man to understand the crimes. But basically a remarkable individual, and I'm talking to my half-sister on the phone a couple of days after his passing, and she says to me, "Well, you know, Steve, our father was a suspect in the Black Dahlia murder." I said, "What the hell are you talking about, Tamar? Where is this coming from?" And she said, "Well, he didn't do it, but he was suspected by the police. They told me that back during the trial." Well, my half-sister and I had talked to maybe 20 minutes in 50 years. So this was a huge shock. Of course, I had become very close to my father in the last decade of his life. He had relocated back to the U.S. And there was no way. I said, this isn't possible. So basically I started looking into it, and you know, I had been a homicide detective for 24 years with LAPD, and I'd been retired for 15 years. And never any hints or clues or anything. So I was confident that I'd be able to establish that he had nothing to do with it. And I started following the evidence. It became a fileable case. I submitted it in secret to the DA, and he said that he would file the case where my father's still alive.
So Steve, just tell us about the evidence that you have. What did you find?
Oh gosh, well it took me 5 books to do it, but basically to cut to the chase, first of all, they knew that she had been found at a vacant lot, posed, and surgically bisected, not cut in half with a saw but it was a skilled surgeon. So of course that limits your pool right there. Well, my father had been a surgeon in his early years of doctoring, so he certainly had that ability. But then there were a whole bunch of things. Then I would discover that he actually knew her and was dating her. He had become a suspect in 1949 and arrested for incest, for having sexual relations with my half-sister Tamar. Back in 49, 3-week trial. He beat the case, but basically there were 3 witnesses present, adults. And so he was a powerful, what they called in that day, a high jingo. He was untouchable, and the head of LA County Health Department. And I started digging in, and eventually I built a case that would, basically open the door to the secret files, which nobody knew anything about. We got into those DA files, and lo and behold, he was the prime suspect all along. Steve Hodel could talk for, 20 hours on why his father did it, but here we've actually got an independent, separate file locked away for 55 years.
And Steve, it's incredible because your dad basically confessed to the murder of Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, and his secretary. Why was he not prosecuted?
Well, actually, what they did was they tape recorded him, 18 detectives, 24/7 for 42 days, around the clock. And they got him not only to confess to the Black Dahlia murder, and these are not phone taps, these are like microphones hidden in the wall that he had no idea were there. And so he cops to paying police, and you have to understand LA was a very corrupt department back then. It was a real life LA Confidential, if you will. And so a lot of the cops were on the take, and Dad had a lot of money and a lot of power and a lot of influence. And he was performing abortions for the police department and the politicos of the day. And he was about to be arrested by the DA's office, who had actually taken over the investigation. And we're literally days away from arresting him, and he splits, leaves the country. And he's in the wind. And you kind of have to understand the politics of LA at the time. Chief Parker, who's our most famous police chief, was about to take over, literally weeks away from becoming chief. And they thought, well, wait a minute, he's in the wind, he's gone, he's left the country. Maybe it's best if we just lock this away for now and keep it under wraps. We'll come back to it, but let's clean up Dodge, get rid of all the corruption. If we expose this now, we won't be able to assume power and do what we want to do. So that was a major factor, and of course, they were happy that he was gone in the sense that, he could reveal a hell of a lot about a hell of a lot of people. The sad thing is they never came back to it. They just locked it away. Actually, the LAPD destroyed all the files and the tapes. Wow. But the DA's office, the lieutenant in charge, kept a second set of books, locked him away.
In 2012, Steve bought a police dog with him back to George Hodel's home. The police dog was able to pick up the scent of human remains, so they took soil samples from the alley at the back of the house for testing. The results were positive for human remains having been there. The case is currently unsolved. A man using the name Roland T. Owen booked into the Hotel President in Kansas City on Wednesday, the 2nd of January 1935 at 1:20 p.m. He was given the room 1046. The man looked to be between the ages of 20 to 35 years old, had brown hair with a scar on his scalp, and the man also had a cauliflower ear. Roland was escorted to room 1046 by the bellboy Randolph Probst, and when he was taken up to his room, Randolph Probst saw that Roland had only packed a brush, toothpaste, and a hair comb. When the hotel maid named Mary Soptic went into Roland's hotel room to clean it, Roland had been inside and told her that when she was finished cleaning, to not lock the door when she was leaving as his friend was coming. Mary Soptic noticed that Roland had kept the curtains shut and the lights off, and the only thing lighting up the dark room was a dim lamp. She came again that day around 4 p.m. with fresh towels, and when she went inside, Mary saw Roland laying on the bed awake and in complete darkness with the door unlocked, and saw a note had been left which read, "Dawn, I will be back in 15 minutes, wait." 3rd of January, the next day, Mary came back around 10:30 a.m. so she could clean his room, but the door was locked from the outside. After managing to get inside, she found Roland sat in the room with no lights on in silence. As she went about cleaning the room, Roland answered the phone and she heard him say, "No, Dawn, I don't want to eat. I'm not hungry, I just had breakfast." Then he firmly said, "No, I am not hungry." Mary came back again at 4 p.m. with fresh towels and heard two men speaking inside room 1046. When she knocked on the door, a male voice said, "Who is it?" And when she said she had fresh towels, the voice said, "We don't need any." And later that night, a woman staying in a room a few doors down heard a man and a woman swearing and shouting. On the 4th of January, the hotel's phone operator realized at 7 a.m. that Roland's phone had been off the hook for a few hours, so the operator sent the bellboy up to check on what was happening. When the bellboy got up there, the door had a "Do Not Disturb" sign on it. He then knocked on the door and heard a voice gently say, "Come in, turn on the lights." But when the bellboy tried to open the door was locked, so he began knocking again but got no answer, so he said through the door, put the phone back on the hook, and then left. When the phone was still off of the hook by 8:30 a.m., they sent up another bellboy to room 1046, and this time, he let himself into the room. When he walked into the dark room, he saw Roland laying on the bed naked and noticed the bed sheets around Roland had a dark substance on them. The bellboy decided to walk around over to the phone stand, seeing the phone had been knocked over, and fixed it before leaving. After 10:30 a.m., the phone was again off the hook, so the bellboy was sent again to handle the situation. When he went up and entered the room, he told police, "When I entered the room, the man was within 2 feet of the door on his knees and elbows, holding his head in his hands. I noticed blood on his head. I then turned the light on. I looked around and saw blood on the walls, on the bed and in the bathroom." When detectives arrived to the scene, Roland was still alive, and had been tied with a cord that was around his neck, wrists, and ankles, and they saw blood all over the walls and the ceiling. One of the detectives asked him who had been in the room with him. Roland replied, "Nobody." Roland then told the detectives, "I fell in the bathtub." At this point, Roland became unconscious and was transported to hospital, and doctors there said his injuries were around 7 hours old. When looking around the hotel room, detectives were shocked to find that Roland had no belongings in the room and found no weapon, although they managed to find 4 fingerprints on the phone handle that was likely a woman's. Roland died around midnight that night, and after an autopsy was performed, they found that he had been repeatedly hit on the head and he had got a fractured skull. He was also stabbed a number of times in the chest and had a punctured lung and bruising on his neck. Detectives then went about looking for his family to inform them, and they found out that when he had checked into the hotel, he told people he was from Los Angeles, but when detectives went to LA police, they could find no record of a Roland T. Owen. Unable to identify who the man really was, his body was put for public viewing at the Melody McGilly Funeral Home. Police also started trying to find out who Don was, the man he had been talking to on the phone. Detectives were unable to find out who Don was. By the 3rd of March, it was decided that Roland would be buried in a potter's field, which was announced in the Journal-Post newspaper. An unidentified person then rang the funeral home to say they would send money so Roland could be buried properly, and on the 23rd of March 1935, the funeral home received a newspaper that had money hidden inside of it. The Flower Rock Company then had a request for flowers to be arranged through them along with a card reading, "Love Forever, Louise." This was then put on his grave. A woman had also called the local newspaper saying to them, "You have a story in your paper that is wrong. Roland Owen will not be buried in a pauper's grave. Arrangements have been made for his funeral. When they asked her about who she was and what she knew about what had happened to Roland, she told them, "Never mind, I know what I am talking about. He got into a jam." She then hung up. A man then called the funeral home and told them, "Don't bury Owen in a pauper's grave. I want you to bury him in Memorial Park Cemetery, then he will be near my sister. I'll send funds to cover the funeral expenses," and the man then went on to tell them how Roland had jilted a woman who he was engaged to, and then said, "Cheaters usually get what's coming to them." Then, the Rock Flower Company got another request on a phone call to have 13 American Beauty roses sent to Roland's funeral, with the caller saying, "I'm doing this for my sister." 1936, over a year later, the friend of a woman called Ruby Ogletree was reading a newspaper when she came upon an article talking about the murder of Roland T. Owen, which had a picture of him. She showed it to Ruby Ogletree and she was able to correctly identify the man as her 17-year-old son, Artemis Ogletree. Her son, Artemis, had left his home in Birmingham in 1934, and in the time after he had died, Ruby received 3 letters which were typed claiming to be him and what he was doing in his life, although she was suspicious when she had received the letters, as her son didn't know how to type and the style of talking didn't sound like Artemis. Although now police knew the man's real name was Artemis Ogletree, they still didn't know who was responsible for his murder. In the 2000s, the author of an article on the case received a phone call from an unidentified person claiming they had just found a box filled with newspaper articles about the murder among an old person's belongings, and that something else was in the box that was connected to the case but never said what it was, before they hung up. The case remains unsolved. One night before Christmas in 1945, at a home in Fayetteville, West Virginia, the Sodder family, consisting of George and Jenny Sodder and their 9 children, were asleep in their home when a fire broke out around 1 a.m. Parents George and Jenny managed to escape with their 4 oldest children, but their other 5 children were still trapped inside the home as the fire engulfed their house. In the bedrooms at the top of the house were Maurice, aged 14, Martha, aged 12, Louis, aged 9, Jenny, aged 8, and Betty, aged 5. After being outside, their dad George had tried to get back into the house to get his 5 children, but the fire on the staircase was too intense, so he went back outside to get his ladder to try to climb up the house. But when he got to where he usually kept his ladder, it was missing, and when he tried to start his vehicles, they were not turning on. One of their children who got out with them, Marion, went to a neighbor's house for them to call the fire department, but when they called, the operator didn't respond, so that neighbor had to drive into town, where they located the fire chief, called F. J. Morris, and although the fire department was only located 2.5 miles away, they arrived to the Sodders' house at 8 a.m., 7 hours later, and by the time they finally got there, the Sodders' home was burnt down to mainly ash. Authorities soon began to comb through the ashes to retrieve human remains of the 5 children, but shockingly, they found nothing, which the fire chief claimed the fire may have been hot enough that it had cremated their bodies fully, although this is disputed by professionals because when burned, bones are usually left behind even in small fragments. The fire was put down to bad wiring and death certificates were issued a week later. Although their house had been burnt to ash, the basement of it still remained there, so George filled it in and created a memorial there for his children, but after a while, George and Jenny concluded their kids were not killed in the fire but had instead been kidnapped, and that someone had purposely set the fire as a distraction. George had also recently had the wiring checked and it was deemed the wiring was safe. Other reasons they believe their kids were still alive was because of arguments he was having within their local Italian community over Mussolini, and not long before the fire had started, a life insurance salesman had went to their house, but when he was unable to sell life insurance to them, he started screaming at George, "Your goddamn house is going up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed. You're going to be paid for the dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini." During the days leading up to the fire, two of the sons who survived claimed they had seen a man watching the youngest Sodder children as they made their way home from school. On the night of the fire, around 12:20 a.m., their house phone rang, so Jenny left the bed and answered it, and as she did, she observed that the lights downstairs had been turned on, and after this, she went back to bed, and as she was starting to fall asleep, she was woken by a massive bang noise come from their roof, then the sound of something roll across it. She fell asleep again and then was woken by the smell of smoke come into her bedroom. Contradicting the conclusion that the fire had been caused by bad wiring, if that were true, then the lights in the house would not have been on, which the whole Sodder family had seen the lights on even while the fire was burning inside the house. A witness eventually came forward saying they had observed a man using a block and tackle, which is an item that people use to remove the engines from cars. One day as they were visiting the Sodders' memorial, one of the surviving daughters saw a hard object in their yard which she showed to her parents. George looked at the item and suspected it to be a napalm bomb, a bomb that was being used in wars. Thinking about there being no trace of human remains left behind, their mother, Jenny Sodder, decided to do her own experiment where she burnt the bones of Onimus, and all the burnt bones left remains, and she later went to a crematorium worker who explained to Jenny that when a body is being cremated at 2000 degrees for 2 hours, bones are still left behind. Also, in the rubble and ash left behind of what used to be their house, their household appliances were still found in the rubble. Also, numerous sightings of the children were called in. One from a woman who said that she had seen the children inside a car at the time the fire was burning the house. The morning after the fire, at a location 50 miles west of Fayetteville, a worker from a tourist stop told police, "I served them breakfast. There was a car with Florida license plates at the tourist court, too." A week later in Charleston at a hotel, a woman claimed she had seen 4 of the 5 children, telling investigators the children were accompanied by 2 women and 2 men, all of Italian extraction. I do not remember the exact date. I tried to talk to the children in a friendly manner, but the man appeared hostile and refused to allow me to talk to these children. I sensed that I was being frozen out, and so I said nothing more. They left early the next morning. A few years later, the Sodder family hired a private investigator called C.C. Tinsley. C.C. Tinsley found out that one of the coroner's jury was actually the same man who had tried to sell George Sodder life insurance, then screamed at him about his house going up in smoke. C.C. Tinsley then heard from the town's minister about a rumor the fire chief was telling people about finding a heart in the house ashes, and that he had actually locked it inside a box and buried it where the Sodders' home used to be. C.C. Tinsley then convinced the fire chief to show him where he had buried the heart, and when the fire chief took him to it, he dug it up and it was found to actually be a beef's liver, which was proven to have never even been in a fire. When asked why he had lied about such a thing, the fire chief said he had only done it to give the Sodder family closure. George and Jenny went on to set up a billboard located on Route 16 with a picture of their missing children, appealing for help. This billboard stayed there for 40 years. People have had many theories, from mafia involvement to the children being sent off to an orphanage. One day they got a letter claiming their missing daughter, Martha, was by then living in a convent in St. Louis. George exhaustively looked into every single tip he received, traveling to all the places sightings had been claimed and doing all he could, but nothing ever came of any of the leads. In 1968, addressed only to Jenny Sodder, was a photograph which had been postmarked from Kentucky. The photo was of a man possibly in his 20s. The Sodders believed this man might be their son Louis, who was 9 at the time of the fire, because the man in the picture had the same brown eyes, curly hair, same nose, and same upward tilted eyebrow. Written on the back of the picture was the words, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Lil boys a 9132 or 35 foot." Even stranger, was they hired a new private investigator with the task of traveling to Kentucky to find the man in the photograph, but this private investigator ended up going missing during this and was never seen or heard from again. Cynthia Anderson was raised in a strict family of Christian fundamentalists, and her dad had described her, saying she was a quiet and obedient type of girl, who never made waves, yet had lots of friends. She spent her days and free time attending church, and she was under strict rules and a curfew from her parents at the age of 20 in 1981. Her dad also commented on her, saying she was spending a lot of time on her face, becoming a bit of a debutante. Cynthia was working as a legal secretary in Toledo but was planning to leave her job so she could attend Bible college. The year before she went missing, on the wall opposite her work window outside, someone had spray-painted the words, "I love Cindy," by G.W. The writing stayed up there for 6 months, then it was covered over, but the message was spray-painted back on there after a few weeks had passed. During the summer of 1981, Cynthia started to get phone calls from an anonymous person, and one time, in front of a work client, recalled that once she got a call, she picked up the phone then quickly hung up, and when it started ringing again, she appeared scared. She then told people she was getting recurring nightmares, that she was kidnapped and then murdered by a stranger. Due to the recent events, her employer advised her to always keep the work doors locked, and they went on to install an alarm at her desk which would alert to a local business if she pressed it. On Tuesday, the 8th of August 1981, she left her parents' home at 8:30 a.m. and drove over to where she worked on East Manhattan Boulevard and was last seen there at 9:45 a.m. When her employer, attorney James Rabbit, got to the law office, he saw the lights and radio were still on, but Cynthia was not there and the office door was still locked from the inside. Cynthia's car was in the parking lot, but her purse and keys were missing. On her work desk, a romance book she had been reading was open on the page where the character was kidnapped at knife point. After her disappearance, the man who had spray-painted the "I love you Cindy" message came forward to investigators and told them he had written that message, but it was a different Cindy who he was romantically involved with. In September 1981, a call came in to police from a whispering woman who claimed that Cynthia was being held in the basement of a White House which was connected by another house owned by the same family, and that the son of the family had kidnapped her. People have different theories, from Cynthia faking her abduction to her having a stalker. Her case remains unsolved. On Friday, the 23rd of August 1912, 4-year-old Bobby Dunbar and his family were staying at a family cabin on Swayze Lake, Louisiana. It was mainly wooded and swamp-like. There were 11 people staying at the cabin: his parents Leslie and Percy Dunbar, his brother Alonzo with other friends and family members. When his dad, Percy, left for work, his mother Leslie was making fish. Their family friend, Paul Mizzy, was taking a few of them to the lake to shoot garfish, and Bobby wanted to go with them all. Paul Mizzy would often take Bobby horseback riding and called Bobby the nickname Heavy. When the group of boys were eventually called back to eat lunch, they started walking back to the cabin. Paul says he put Alonzo, Bobby's brother, on his shoulders, then jokingly told Bobby, "Get out of the way, Heavy, or I'll run you over," to which Bobby replied, "You can't do it, you ain't no bigger than me." They all continued walking back to the cabin. As the group returned, Leslie noticed that Bobby was not with them, so she and Paul Mizzy started shouting Bobby's name before Leslie fainted on the floor. 3 of the men from their group began searching around the lake, and during their search, they bumped into Bobby's dad, who was just walking home from work. As the search continued into the night, the searchers used dynamite to blast the lake so they would be able to spot if his body was in the lake, and they also used cables with hooks on them and ran them throughout the lakes before divers then went in, but still, no trace of Bobby was found. When he had gone missing, he was wearing a straw hat, so they did a test with a similar hat so test how long it could float on a lake, and they found it can float there for hours, which told them that if he was in the lake, his hat would have been floating somewhere, but they never found his hat anywhere. After realizing he couldn't be in the lake, they theorized he may have been eaten by an alligator, so they started cutting open alligators in the hope of finding any remains inside them, but still found nothing. By Saturday the 24th, more than 500 men took part in searches for Bobby Dunbar. After the Dunbar family went back home, Paul Mizzy and a few more friends stayed back at the camp for a few more weeks to continue searching. During another search, a set of footprints that had not been wearing shoes were found walking towards a railroad bridge, walking out of the swamp. At the end of August, police got in contact with the police in New Orleans, 130 miles away, to see if they could find Bobby down there. Bobby's dad also traveled to New Orleans, where he handed out more than 700 photos of Bobby. Their town contributed towards a $1,000 reward for someone to return Bobby back to his parents. In April 1913, someone came to inform the Dunbars that local man William Cantwell Walters was just seen in southern Mississippi with a young boy who looked like Bobby, and when confronted by police, he was telling them various stories about who the child belonged to, and he was also seen whipping the young boy. The child was taken and they believed the boy was Bobby, and when the Dunbars were sent pictures of the boy, they traveled to Mississippi to see the boy for themselves. When Leslie saw the boy, he didn't respond to the name Bobby, and when she tried to hold him, he wouldn't hug her back. The next day, authorities allowed Leslie to bath the boy, and whilst bathing him, she shouted out, "Thank God, it is my boy," then she fainted. William C. Walters was arrested and insisting the boy was actually called Bruce Anderson, the son of his brother and a woman called Julia Anderson. The boy's mom, Julia Anderson, was back in North Carolina caring for his elderly parents and was a single mom. When police contacted her, Julia verified that she had let William look after her son for a while. It was then decided by authorities and the Dunbars that the boy wasn't Julia's son and instead was Bobby Dunbar, and he was sent to live with the Dunbars, returning to their town riding on a fire engine covered in flowers and then being gifted with a new pony and a bike by the Dunbars. After he arrived to live with them, William Cantwell Walters then sent a letter to the Dunbars saying, "I know by now you have decided. You are wrong. It is very likely I will lose my life on account of that, and if I do, the great God will hold you accountable." He was being held in prison being charged with kidnap, which was at that time a capital offense punishable with death. A newspaper made arrangements for Julia Anderson to travel to Mississippi so she could see the boy herself and identify him as her son, but even after she arrived, the Dunbars and their town had already decided the boy was Bobby Dunbar. Julia said that she knew in her heart that was her son, Bruce Anderson, but she was forced to return home without him. After Julia returned back to her hometown, newspapers began a campaign of harassment against her, saying she had 3 children with 2 different men, then calling her a prostitute and joking about the fact that she had no children left because her daughter was given up for adoption. Her other child had died when it was a baby and she had been wrongfully blamed, then cleared of his death, then she had Bruce removed from her care. Another newspaper wrote an article about Julia Anderson saying she had forgotten him. Animals don't forget, but this big, coarse country woman, several times a mother, she forgot. In the end, a court ruled the boy to be officially Bobby Dunbar, and he went to stay with the Dunbars. During his 2-week trial for kidnap, William Cantwell Walters was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, but after 2 years in prison, his conviction was overturned. The boy grew up and got married around the age of 18 to a woman called Marjorie in 1935 and passed away in 1966, always believing he was Bobby Dunbar. But in 1999, his granddaughter, Margaret Dunbar Cutright, started doing family research and was always fascinated by her granddad's kidnapping, but when she read through a scrapbook filled with newspaper articles on the case, she started to notice that the articles were saying different things, such as one saying Leslie and Percy originally stating that the boy didn't even look like their son, Bobby, and another article stated Julia Anderson felt the Dunbars had kidnapped her son from her. The granddaughter of Julia Anderson made a statement, explaining, "All of us cousins grew up. We knew that we had an uncle that had been taken by the Dunbar family in Opelousas, Louisiana. We always said kidnapped. We always said they kidnapped him." Margaret Dunbar Cutright then asked for DNA testing to be done, so her dad Bobby Dunbar Jr. gave his own DNA sample, which was then compared with Alonzo Dunbar's son's DNA. The results showed they weren't a match, meaning the boy was never really Bobby Dunbar. Mary Reeser was home in her St. Petersburg, Florida apartment as her son came to visit her. They spoke and she mentioned to him she had just taken 2 Seconal tablets, medication taken by patients before going into surgery, although she had not been prescribed these tablets. Her son soon left and Mary sat in her chair, maybe falling asleep as she did. Around 5 a.m., her landlady began to smell smoke somewhere but didn't think anything else of it, and at 8 a.m. the landlady was on her way to Mary's apartment to give her a telegram, but as she made her way to the apartment, the smell of smoke struck her again and she found soot in the hallway. She went to open Mary's apartment door but couldn't as the door handle was too hot, so she had help from nearby house painters who were then able to get inside. When they all got into her apartment, they found Mary's cremated remains. Police soon arrived and found Mary's skull had shrunk to the size of a cup and bits of her spine amongst the cremated remains, apart from her left foot sticking out from the cremated remains, completely unburnt, but the rest of Mary's body was cremated. Detectives were also shocked as the area surrounding her chair was not burned. The only thing that had burned was Mary and her chair. Also, the wall around her chair showed no signs of fire scorching. Experts came out and said that for Mary's body to have been cremated the way it had, it would need to burn for 3 or 4 hours at 3,000 degrees. The detective working on her case found it all perplexing, and a professor of physical anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania said he was both amazed and baffled and was quoted saying he couldn't conceive of such a complete cremation of the apartment myself, and that in all his years working in fire investigations he had never seen a skull shrink the way Mary's had. Parts of the chair, rug, debris, and smoke were sent off to the FBI for chemical analysis, but the results found no trace of combustibles, but they did find melted fat in the rug. Detectives at the scene also ruled out the possibility of electrical or lighting failure. One theory suggests that she was a victim of human combustion, like what happened in 1982 to Jean Safin when she was sat at her kitchen table and burst into flames in front of her family. Although there is no definitive answer as to why Mary's body was cremated, her unburnt leg sticking out of her ashes and her shrunken skull, and why her surroundings were not scorched, people theorize she combusted.